A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
I was scrolling through some maps the other day, looking at the way the borders of the Middle East were drawn after the First World War, and it is just striking how much they look like. Someone took a ruler to a piece of paper without actually looking at who was living on the ground. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the people who have spent the last century essentially living as a quiet, and sometimes not so quiet, revolt against those very lines on the map. We are talking about the Bedouin.
It is a massive topic, Corn. Herman Poppleberry here, and I have to say, Daniel really hit on something fundamental with this one. When most people think of the Bedouin, they have this cinematic image in their head of Lawrence of Arabia. You know, nomads on camels moving across shifting dunes. But the reality in March of 2026 is that we are looking at a post-nomadic society of about 4 million people who are deeply integrated into modern states, even as they maintain a tribal architecture that predates every single one of those states. Only about 5% of that 4 million still live as pastoral semi-nomads. The rest are in cities, townships, or what the State of Israel calls unrecognized villages.
Post-nomadic. That is an interesting way to put it, because if they are not moving around with the seasons anymore, what makes them Bedouin? Is it just heritage, or is there something more functional happening there?
That term actually comes from Dawn Chatty, an anthropologist at Oxford who has done some incredible work on this. Her argument is that Bedouin identity is not defined by the act of wandering, but by genealogy and the tribe. Even if a Bedouin family has lived in a concrete house in a city for 3 generations, their primary social and political orientation is still toward their tribal confederation. It is a portable identity. You can take it into a high-tech office in Tel Aviv or a military outpost in Jordan, and the rules of kinship still apply. It is a social software that runs on top of whatever physical territory they happen to be in.
Which is why those Westphalian borders we mentioned are so problematic for them. If your primary loyalty is to a confederation like the Shema, which stretches across Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and Jordan, then a border post in the middle of the desert feels like a very recent, very artificial imposition.
The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 and the subsequent mandate borders cut directly across tribal territories that had existed for centuries. The Shamar are the perfect example of that cross-border resilience. During the height of the Syrian civil war, when state infrastructure was collapsing, it was the Shamar kinship networks that allowed people to move herds and supplies from Syria into Jordan and even up toward Turkey. They were using a social map that was centuries old to navigate a crisis that the modern states could not handle. They treat borders as suggestions rather than barriers.
It feels like this creates a permanent tension with the nation-state. A state wants to know exactly where its citizens are, who owns which square meter of land, and where the taxes are going. But a tribal system is much more fluid.
That is the core conflict, especially in Israel right now. We are seeing this play out in the Negev in a way that is incredibly complex. On one hand, you have the Israeli state trying to implement these massive land regularization policies, like the new resolution passed in 2025. The goal there is to formally integrate about 150,000 Bedouins into permanent settlements with actual infrastructure, you know, electricity, water, roads. But to do that, the state is demanding that the Bedouin drop their historical land claims and move into these concentrated hubs.
And that is where things get heated, right? Because from the state's perspective, they are providing modern services. But from the Bedouin perspective, they are being pushed off their ancestral lands to make way for new Jewish settlements. I mean, look at what happened with the village of al-Hiran.
Al-Hiran is the flashpoint everyone points to. It was demolished to make way for a new town called Dror, and it highlights the structural paradox of the Bedouin in Israel. You have communities where the men are volunteering for the Israel Defense Forces, serving in these elite tracking units, literally protecting the borders of the state, and then they come home to a village that the state refuses to recognize as legal. We are talking about roughly 25 to 40% of the 305,000 Bedouin in the Negev living in 35 unrecognized villages. These places have no legal status, no paved roads, and no grid electricity.
I wanted to ask you about those trackers, actually, because that is a very specific, culturally grounded role within the military. It is not just that they are soldiers, they're using traditional desert skills for modern border security.
It is a deeply specialized craft. They are patrolling the borders with Gaza, Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon. They can look at a patch of dirt and tell you how many people crossed, what they were carrying, and how long ago they passed. It is a level of environmental literacy that is almost impossible to teach in a standard military course. And Israel is unique in the region because it permits Bedouin to volunteer for the military, even though other Palestinian Arab citizens are generally not drafted. It creates this very distinct identity layer where you have Bedouin who are fiercely proud of their service and their contribution to Israeli security, yet they are caught in this legal limbo regarding their homes.
It is a tragic irony that became very visible on October 7th, 2023. We saw 22 Bedouins killed in that attack. 7 of them were killed by rockets that fell directly on unrecognized villages in the Negev. These are villages that do not have iron dome protection or bomb shelters because, legally, the state says they are not supposed to be there.
That is the visceral reality of it. You have citizens dying for the state and from the state's enemies, while living in the shadow of demolition orders. In 2018 alone, over 2,300 structures were demolished in Bedouin communities in the Negev, and the political climate has only gotten more intense. You have ministers like Itamar Ben-Gvir pushing for more aggressive enforcement of land rights, while the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs is framing the whole situation as a violation of indigenous rights.
That word indigenous is doing a lot of heavy lifting in this discussion. We talked about this a bit in episode 1296, the way the term is weaponized or used as a shield depending on who is talking. If the Bedouin are framed as an indigenous minority, it changes the legal and moral weight of their land claims.
And that is exactly why the Israeli government is pushing so hard on the regularization policy. They want to move away from the indigenous framing and toward a citizenship and development framing. The Rifman Law is the big legislative tool for this. It is intended to regulate development, but critics say it is just a faster way to displace people from the rural desert into urban townships. It is about forcing a population that thinks in terms of tribal territory to think in terms of municipal plots.
I wonder if the urban township model actually works for a post-nomadic society. If you take a people whose entire social structure is built around wide open spaces and tribal proximity, and you put them in a high-density apartment block, do you lose the very thing that makes them Bedouin?
Research from 2025 actually looked at this in the context of education. Bedouin students in Israeli universities often experience what the researchers called symbolic inclusion. They are physically there, they are in the classrooms, but they are in structurally exclusionary institutions. They are being integrated into a Western, urbanized model of success that does not always have space for their tribal identity. It is a bit like they are being asked to leave their Bedouinness at the door in exchange for a degree.
But is that unique to Israel? Because when you look at Jordan, the relationship seems totally different. In Jordan, the Bedouin are not just a minority being integrated. They are essentially the bedrock of the monarchy.
Jordan is the fascinating counterexample. While only about 10% of Jordanians are currently nomadic, more than 1/3 of the population traces their roots back to the tribes. The Hashemite monarchy has historically relied on the Banu Sakhr and the Banu al-Huatat as their primary support base. The Jordanian armed forces and the security services are heavily Bedouin. In Jordan, being Bedouin is a mark of elite loyalty to the state. It is the opposite of the revolt we see in other places.
So, in Jordan, the tribe and the state have formed a sort of symbiotic pact. The state gives the tribes power and prestige, and the tribes give the state its legitimacy and its muscle.
Precisely. But even there you see the tension. As the world moves toward more centralized digital governance, the informal power of the tribal sheikh can clash with the formal power of the bureaucrat. And then you have Saudi Arabia, which is taking a much more aggressive approach under Vision 2030.
You were talking about the Neom project, right? The Line City?
Yes, the Tabuk region, where they are building Neom, is the ancestral home of the Huaytut tribe. These are people who have been there for centuries, and the Saudi state, in its push for modernization, has been displacing them by force. There was that high-profile case in 2020 where a tribal member named Abdul Rahim al-Huwaiti was killed by security forces after he refused to leave his home and posted videos about it online. It was a clear message that in the new Saudi Arabia, the megaproject comes before the tribe. The state is no longer negotiating with the tribes, it is steamrolling them.
It is a weird reversal. In Israel, the Bedouin is sometimes seen as a challenge to the Jewish character of the state. In Saudi Arabia, they are a challenge to the modern character of the state. In both cases, the tribe is the other that the state is trying to solve.
And we cannot forget the Bedoon in the Gulf states. The word actually comes from the Arabic phrase Bedoon Jinsiya, meaning without nationality. These are people, many of Bedouin descent, who were in places like Kuwait or the Emirates when the states were formed, but for various reasons were never registered as citizens. They are effectively stateless in the land where their ancestors have lived for 1,000 years. The state uses that statelessness as a tool of control. If you do not have a passport, you do not have rights, even if you are more local than the people running the government.
It really highlights how the nation-state is a jealous god. It does not want any other identity competing for your loyalty. It wants to be the sole provider of your security, your laws, and your identity. But the Bedouin system is a competing architecture. It is a decentralized genealogical network that says, I know who I am because of who my father was, not because of what color my passport is.
And that architecture is incredibly robust. Think about the Shamar again. They have survived the Ottoman Empire, the British Mandate, the rise and fall of the Ba'athists, and the chaos of the Islamic State. They do this by being flexible. They can be urban professionals during the day and tribal elders at night. They can serve in the IDF or the Jordanian army while still maintaining their own internal legal systems for settling disputes through tribal mediation.
I have heard that tribal law is still a major factor in the Negev, even with the presence of the Israeli court system. If there is a dispute between families, they often go to a tribal judge rather than a state judge.
It is often faster and more effective at preventing blood feuds. The state usually looks the other way or even quietly encourages it because it keeps the peace in a way that a formal jail sentence might not. But it is another example of that state within a state dynamic that makes governments so nervous. When the state cannot provide justice or security that matches the cultural expectations of the people revert to the older, more reliable software of the tribe.
So, looking at the future, especially with the 2025 policy shifts in Israel, where does this go? Is the goal of regularization actually achievable, or are we just going to see more cycles of demolition and protest?
I think we are at a turning point. The state is realizing that it cannot simply ignore the unrecognized villages forever, especially after the shared trauma of October 7th. There is a window for a new kind of social contract. But it requires the state to acknowledge that Bedouin identity is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be accommodated. You cannot turn a Bedouin into a suburbanite overnight and expect them to thank you for it. The failure of one-size-fits-all citizenship models is becoming more obvious every year.
It feels like the takeaway here is that identity is not geography. We are so used to thinking of people in terms of where they live on a map, but for the Bedouin, identity is a lineage. It is a social software that runs on top of whatever physical territory they happen to be in. If you want to track how this debate is evolving, I suggest looking at the annual reports from the International Workgroup for Indigenous Affairs. They provide a very different perspective than the official state narratives.
That is a great way to put it. And if you want to understand the Middle East, you have to look at both maps. You have to look at the map of the states, and you have to look at the map of the tribes. If you only look at one, you are missing half the story. The Bedouin are the living bridge between those two worlds, and they are not going anywhere. Their resilience is built into their DNA.
If you want to dive deeper into how these identity layers work, especially in the Israeli context, I really recommend going back to episode 1260. We talked about the broader Arab-Israeli identity there, which provides a lot of the necessary background for why the Bedouin experience is so distinct within that 20% of the population.
And if the whole indigeneity debate we touched on caught your interest, episode 1296 is the one to check out. We really break down the DNA and land claims aspect of that paradox. It is a messy, fascinating area of law and science that directly impacts how the Bedouin are treated in international courts.
It really is. I think we have covered a lot of ground today, from the sands of the Negev to the boardrooms of Neom. It is a reminder that even in 2026, the old ways have a habit of outlasting the new ones. The nation-state is still trying to figure out how to handle a population that doesn't recognize its borders.
They certainly do. Before we wrap up, I want to say thanks to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping us on track.
And a big thank you to Model for providing the GPU credits that keep this show powered and moving.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you are enjoying these deep dives, we would love it if you could leave us a quick review on your podcast app. It really does help other people find the show.
You can also find us at myweirdprompts.com for our full archive and all the ways to subscribe.
Until next time.
See ya.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts, that's the close from sloth